What's up, guys? Welcome back to Elderwood Games. Thomas here, and this week I wanted to talk about kind of just each faction in 40k and sort of my opinions on each of them, what I think they may be missing, and maybe what would drive me into playing them in the future should they add certain things and that sort of deal. So, without further ado, I think it might be best just to get on in this. This may be one of my longer videos, so I hope you guys enjoy this. And I'd love to know your thoughts on each of the factions I mentioned in the comments down below. And let me know how I got some of these wrong, because inevitably I will get something wrong. So for starters, let's go with the Imperium. I'm not the biggest fan of the Imperium armies in general. I'll kind of talk about each of them individually though, to kind of give you my thoughts. So up first, Adeptus Sororitas. I think it's a wonderful range. I think they're incredible models. My wife is building an Adeptus Sororitas army, and she's enjoying the look of them and is getting excited over each of the different model options that she has available. And I think it's a really cool army. Not really for me, just because the models don't really speak to me in a way that the other ones do. I don't really think I'd enjoy piloting the army very much. I think to improve on them, I don't even know if that's the right word. I don't know if there's really anything they could add to it to make them be more appealing to me, honestly. After that, we'll talk about Imperial Guard. Imperial Guard is fascinating. I like the idea of being just either hordes and hordes of humans fighting against the Xenos and heretic threats, or being, you know, the hammer of the Emperor, the vehicles, the tanks and artillery and that sort of thing. I think that's a really interesting sort of dichotomy that you're able to pull off in either direction, and it gives you an extensive array of different units and directions to go with army building that I do actually find pretty interesting. However, I think that overall it's a little bland for me. I like some of the units, some of the scions, and some of their like sort of diesel punky kind of aesthetic, a little bit of steampunk with some of their like sort of dual lensed goggle kind of guys. But yeah, I think for me, I already have Horde with the Tyranids, and the battery of the Imperial Guard doesn't really do enough for me to consider it. But if I ever get into a phase where I really want to paint some cool tanks, it'll definitely be the first one on my list. Next up is Adeptus Mechanicus. Now, I do play Mechanicum for Horus Heresy, and I am painting them for Horus Heresy. But honestly, Mechanicus would be an army I would consider in the future. I really like the Skitarii. I like the look of their like stealthy units. Like, I like the more mechanical styled units, but I also really enjoy sort of the retro punk of the Castellan robots. I think that's sort of, it's a little derpy, but it's also kind of cool, which is what brought, like, kind of drew me into the Mechanicum. So I think if they were to kind of either blend the Mechanicum aesthetic with their current aesthetic and start pushing in that direction, I think it would be a pretty easy switch to go to Mechanicus. And also, I mean, you can't mention them without talking about how expensive they are. I mean, their like average is below $2 or below, it's like $1 per point almost. Like, it's tough, right? And some of the best kits in that army are the biggest like problems with that, right? Like the chicken walker things. Such a cool model, such a fun model, but so poor in like dollar to points amount. It's honestly horrible. I hope that in 11th edition, or even at the end of this edition, maybe they can do something to try and balance some of that out, just to make it feel like a more attainable army. Next up, let's go with Agents of the Imperium. I think the biggest thing they need is just more units. They're pretty sparse as it stands, and really they could just do well with a little bit of an overhaul to their units in general. One thing that I've heard that I think would be an interesting change to them would be to pivot away from them being sort of like the police, the spies, and the assassins for the Imperium, and actually branch more into bringing in like the Death Watch and even the Sororitas and have them be more of what the Imperium is in like lore. Let them, you know, have your Arbites and that sort of thing, but then also have it so if you ally in units from other Imperium forces, they still benefit from the agent's rules, or it's just more of having the Imperium as a cohesive kind of army and being able to sort of pivot the army based on the threats that they are taking. And it could be a very interesting crusade army to do that, where, you know, in the first phase of the crusade, maybe you're having a difficult time with the Xenos factions, so you bring in some Deathwatch kill teams that have, in Agents of the Imperium, they actually do have more exaggerated strength against the Xenos armies and that sort of thing. Or if you're having difficulty with Chaos, maybe you bring in the Grey Knights, and in a similar vein, they have more strengths against Chaos threats. And it could be a very interesting sort of molding where you have access to these other armies that, while typically you do have the allied system, but with the Agents of the Imperium, it has the opportunity to have it be the things that are supposed to be strong against certain things lore-wise can actually expand on that further, and they can have sort of a more, I don't want to say vanilla rule, but sort of more of a overarching rule that can go across every unit that's included, and these exterior units can actually be brought in. Obviously, you have to keep it somewhat balanced in, you know, you can't just play like Grey Knights, but Imperium, you know, Agents of the Imperium, in case they make the army rule stronger than the Grey Knights army rule, for an example. So that would be the one teeter that they have to make sure that they're addressing in order to make that work. But that's what would need me to do to move to Agents of the Imperium. Next up is Imperial Knights. I already have Chaos Knights. I don't really want to go with Imperial Knights just because it's going to be a very similar building experience. The painting experience will be different, I will admit, but I don't really want to have to house two armies of big robots like that. So I do like the Imperial Knights, but I ultimately went with Chaos Knights because my idea for the cryptids just aligned better with the aesthetic of Chaos. So that's why I went with Chaos Knights. But honestly, it probably could have gone either way. If I had had an idea for the Imperial Knights before the cryptids, I likely would have went with Imperial Knights instead. The Custodes, resin, plastic. Do that, and I'll start to consider Custodes. I think that they actually are a pretty interesting army, a very cool aesthetic army. I think you have some direction you can go if you want to maybe branch away from the typical kind of gold and scarlet kind of theme that they typically have. I've seen some very interesting silver or cool bronze or even black armored Custodes in my shop and just online. I think they have a lot of freedom with color because they are, while they have good design sculpturally, they stand out as being somewhat simplistic, that you can sort of push the color a bit more if you would like, and I think that would be the more interesting thing for Custodes. I don't really desire playing them just because they do kind of seem like the immovable object kind of army where it is basically just near impossible to just wipe units. They would also be one of those armies where you have to you really have to play things you don't want in like transports and vehicles because they do move rather slow, sort of like Death Guard, but I think Death Guard has some more interesting options, but we'll get to them in a minute. So Custodes, really, I would just want to see some of their cooler resin kits be ported over into plastic, so that way you won't be paying the Forge World tax in order to play the cool stuff in that army. Next up is Space Marines, and potentially controversially, I'm just going to kind of talk as Space Marines as a whole, including the non-Codex compliant ones, just because for me, Space Marines is less, it's more of an aesthetic thing for me that I don't really want to play them anymore. I played Salamanders. I still have my Salamanders army. It is posted to sell, so I did do the goal for this month. For me, I find them rather boring, and a big part of the hobby for me is painting, and I want to be excited to paint. I think I would like to see some, maybe a new armor mark, or potentially even some kind of upgrading sprue, or like Legion of the Damned models. I think those could be a lot of fun to paint. Obviously, you can get into the whole like 3D printed bits and that sort of thing, which would be an option. But for me, I don't really enjoy the way that the Space Marines play. I mainly did the Firestorm Assault, which I know isn't the best one. And obviously with Vulcan's new model, they upgraded it. For me, Space Marines is just kind of in the past. But that wraps up the armies of the Imperium and kind of my thoughts on each of those. But let's move into the armies of Chaos. So we'll start with Chaos Knights. I'm already playing them, or I'm already beginning to assemble them, and will be playing them in the next edition. So really, they don't really need anything, in my opinion, to make them a thing. It would be nice, hopefully the kind of cultist detachment that we have currently in 10th edition carries on into 11th edition, either, as a 10.5 update, you can keep your old codex and detachments, or we see a new version of it in the 11th edition codex or index, however they end up doing it, just because I think the cultists being with the knights is kind of a cool idea, and it makes for an interesting army choice where you have to maybe not take as many of the war dogs in place of cultists, and the cultists are actually able to move with a little bit more freedom to be able to accomplish your secondaries and that sort of thing. So it can kind of balance some things out in a good way, and it also gives you a little bit of freedom because you can have cultists themed around your thing, which I kind of plan to do with some of mine if that were to be a thing for 11th edition. Moving on to Chaos Demons, one of two things. Either we just need kind of more, or like at least like a designated codex that you can use for them, so it can be like its own thing. Or I think it could be kind of cool if we actually go into the Demon Engine kind of route, and we actually start to see, the older Demon Engines get new sculpts, and then we get new Demon Engine kits. So that way we're not relying solely on like the Age of Sigmar line to play in 40k, and we can have more like 40k looking demon armies. I think the mixture of fantasy and sci-fi is completely fine, and I think it's not really jarring in a sense. I just think it would be a really cool way to have Chaos Demons in 40k if they are these like amalgamations of flesh, warp energy, and machine, instead of it being like, hey, these are fantasy demons that are now in 40k with no like visual representation of them being from this time period. Moving on to Chaos Space Marines, basically the same reason for Space Marines. I do think aesthetically they are better than Space Marines. I would probably be more likely to play Chaos Space Marines than regular Space Marines. But yeah, it mainly comes down to that. I do think it'd be interesting, if I end up enjoying the Chaos kind of feel going forward, I may end up making a small warband of Chaos Space Marines to have for each of my different cryptids, just to have some varied approach and be able to do some cool things. So next up, I think I might just kind of lump the 4 Chaos Legions sort of together. So Death Guard, World Eaters, Emperor's Children, and Thousand Sons. I think they're actually all really good ranges. I think if I had to pick one to play, I would probably choose Death Guard just because I do like them the most aesthetically. And I do think it'd be kind of cool to do some kit bashing with Age of Sigmar and their new Maggotkin that are coming, and give some of that Nordic kind of folklore knight aesthetic into blending into the 40k aesthetic. Could be really cool, and I like green, so there you go. As far as the other ones, I actually do like the sculpts and stuff for the World Eaters. I don't think I would necessarily like playing them very much. I like melee, it's pretty fun, but I like it with my Tyranids because it's just kind of like unending waves, and that's more what I would like. That's more like the power fantasy, I think, for me. Thousand Sons look cool. There's definitely some models that I wouldn't mind painting in that range. I'd love to see maybe some updates, some more modeling options with some of them. They are just like empty husks with, you know, spirit sand within them, but having some more modeling options would be pretty cool. And Emperor's Children just needs more stuff. Let's face it, they don't have enough anti-tank and enough ways to get around the board very quickly, and they are kind of meant to be that. They're meant to be quick, they're meant to be agile, so I would love to see them get some new tools in their toolbox, maybe some old tools brought back to life to be able to use going forward. I just don't think the range is as developed as it needs to be. If I had to pick one, it'd probably be Death Guard. All right, and that wraps up the Chaos factions. So now, probably my favorite out of the three is the Xenos factions. I just find the Xenos models are a little bit more interesting. They appeal to me more, and they kind of get the creative juices flowing a bit more, and I like them. Simple as that. So I think I'll start with the two that I do play, so that way we can kind of talk about what I'd like to see in those and what I feel about them, and then go through the other ones and what they may need for me to consider playing them. So starting with Tau, my first army. Tau's an interesting one because you kind of have two diverting paths here, right? You have the Tau as the, you know, mech suit, battle armor aesthetic that I really like. That is the direction I would like them to go. The issue is that the Tau is the like auxiliary conglomerate of the Xenos, and that would mean that they need more variety of models outside of just the Tau and the battle suit. So that's kind of the issue, right? Is either they lean full tilt into battle suits, or they lean kind of full tilt into auxiliaries. And one thing they kind of did that I feel like sort of shot them in the foot is create all the different Kroot. The Kroot are interesting. They're not my favorite. I've mentioned that before. I don't really like them. I doubt I will ever really play them in my Tau army. But now the Kroot basically have their own detachment. There's enough models and everything that you can technically do a full Kroot army with very minimal inclusion of Tau battle suits and units. So it almost feels like Kroot is their own thing, and then you have Tau, and then you have the Vespid, which is just a kill team that you can bring in. I like the Vespid. I've considered getting them for my collection. Haven't pulled the trigger yet, but we'll see. But it's kind of like, I really like battle suits, and I would like it if they just did the battle suits and maybe detached the auxiliary part and made that its own thing. It could be kind of cool. I think thematically they potentially could do it and basically have it be like Farsight Enclave be their own army, and then Tau, but then it just gets weird and it doesn't really make any sense, because then it's like, okay, what units can you do both? And I don't know. That's like one thing I'm not too happy with how Tau is treated, because like Battlesuit's really cool, Alien Auxiliary also really cool, but they haven't built toward Alien Auxiliary really. It's like you have Tau, you have Kroot, and you have one unit of Vespid, and the Kroot are basically like a second army within Tau. So it's kind of like, where are we going? Like, are we going to have a new alien species in 11th edition that can actually make the auxiliary feel worth it? Or are we going to pivot and have like Kroot be sort of its own thing and see that continue to expand and have more and more models? I don't know. I'm definitely sticking with Tau. I'm definitely sticking with Battlesuits. I think the new Battlesuit characters that are coming are very interesting. I think it has the potential to create more Battlesuits for us to be able to have in the future, to kind of make way for new design and new units to have a more diverse, is the word I was looking for, a more diverse collection of Battlesuits at our disposal. So that would be my hope for Tau going forward. Next up is Tyranids. I love the Tyranids. I think they are great. I think the range is unique enough that you can kind of find a direction and have plenty of models to go in that direction and continue going forward. I think for me, what I would like to see is just some of our older kits be upgraded. I think having a newer warrior kit would be really cool. I think having the winged warriors as an option, I believe they used to be called Shrikes. I think that would be a great addition. Have them be able to be led by the Winged Hive Tyrant or the Winged Tyranid Prime. And I would like, I think that's definitely a kit that I would like to see more of. I also think it'd be kind of cool if we got more of the Biovore like insect, arachnid kind of styled stuff. It'd be kind of cool to see that sort of spread into maybe some other designs, because it's kind of a weird thing where some Tyranids lean more dinosaur and some Tyranids lean more insect, and I'd like to see more of both, honestly, but I'd kind of like some of the outliers to maybe be kind of pushed more towards one or the other kind of going forward. But yeah, overall, I think Tyranids are really cool. It'd be interesting to see new gargoyle sculpts as well. I don't really like the old ones. I'm not playing them, and I don't think I will play them until they get updated sculpts, and I can live without them personally. But if they got new sculpts that were really cool, I'm gonna have a hard time not buying them, honestly. So next, let's get into Space Elves. We'll start with the Drukhari. Drukhari, super cool aesthetic. I'm not the biggest fan of like the grotesques and like the Witch Coven side of it. Just not really my thing. But the like Kabalite warriors and sort of the like more raider looking ones, I really like those. And honestly, I was really close to getting the old Combat Patrol before it went out of stock, just because there were still a couple boxes at our Games Workshop, and I just was like really on the verge of getting it. I'm glad I didn't in hindsight, just because the people that did get it, I think, are doing a great job getting those painted and enjoying the army. So I'm glad I didn't kind of take that from them. But also, I am actually looking at Eldari. So Eldari, the kind of nicer, quote unquote, of the Space Elves. I really like Wraiths. I think the Wraiths are really cool. Sort of these, of course, they're some kind of like, you know, spirit-filled robot kind of deal. If you can't sense a theme, I really like robot stuff. I really like having pilots and mechs and that sort of thing. But of course, these are like sentient machines with spirits within them. And their aesthetic's just really cool. I like the really smooth lines, sort of the bubble gem power and that sort of thing. One thing I'd really like to see with the Eldari is the dinosaur riders, the Exodites. I think that would be so sick. So what I'm kind of thinking about doing within 11th edition is starting Eldari, but starting with the Wraiths. I really like the aesthetic of them, and you know, I plan to sort of paint them in a way where they look sort of bone-ish, as if they're like using the bones of their dinosaurs to create the Wraiths, and then they hold the spirit of both like the deceased dinosaur and the warrior within them, making them look a bit tribal. But I also like the idea of looking into getting like a Dremel and Drill and having it be like carved bone to give sort of a different take on sort of just their aesthetic in general. Like they have this really clean aesthetic, and obviously people have done like grimdark and spooky stuff before, but I think pivoting towards this like tribal aspect, sort of these like, you know, dinosaur bone kind of feeling, and then these really intricate kind of carvings and holes and stuff within their helmets, with a few accent colors. Obviously that's something that I enjoy doing, so they're definitely going to have something. I don't know which colors just yet, but that's something that's kind of brewing and will probably be a little bit further down the line. But Eldari is definitely on the menu. They don't really need much to get me pulled in. They have plenty of stuff with the Wraiths, but if they did do Exodites, I would definitely go that route. Next up, we have Leagues of Votann. Leagues of Votann, I think, are really cool. I would like to see more of the heavily armored Votann. I really like the Hecaton and the Sagittar. I think the design of those is really cool. I have this idea of it being like the old school turtle van, that like sort of golden yellow and green, with the 4 turtles kind of headband colors as accent colors. I just think that'd be really fascinating. And just a funny kind of like nod to one of my other favorite franchises. But yeah, I think they just need a few more of the armored troops. I'm not the biggest fan of Berserks, and also the new guys, the Steeljacks, which are like the AI powered kind of automata. Not my favorite like design wise, but they do have a lot of really interesting sculpts, and I do think they're a cool enough looking army that they're definitely kind of in the roster of things that I may end up collecting in the future. Next up is the Orcs. I'm already thinking about doing Orcs for Age of Sigmar. I have some units already. I don't really want to do both. I think if I were to do the orcs, it would probably almost have to be the Mega Dreads. Basically, they're like orc robot kind of guys. I do like their look. I do think it's kind of cool, this like scrapyard grunge, even dipping into like the Mad Max kind of vibes. I just think they're goofy in a good way. I'm not saying they're goofy in a bad way, but they're not goofy in the way that I would want them to be, I think. And also you have your boys, you have your like dreads, you have the snake bites, and then you have your squig riders. You have like, there's a lot of different directions with orcs, and I feel like it's almost too many, and they don't mesh super well. So it's kind of like you almost have to go a certain direction. Like boys and dreads are okay, and then like snake bites and squigs are okay. So it's kind of like 2, but it kind of feels more like 4. So that's like one thing I'm not the biggest fan of with the orcs for 40k. Obviously with Age of Sigmar, you have the Iron Jaws, like the orc war clans, sort of the heavily armored guys, and you have more of the savage orcs, which I think is a very cool way to kind of split them. And they specifically are like separate kind of things, right? You have like 2 differing, basically almost 2 different factions in how they operate. But with 40k, it doesn't, like, you can have the different attachments for them, but it just doesn't really feel exactly the same, if that makes sense. So orcs, probably never going to happen with 40k, if I'm being completely honest. Next up is Genestealer Cults, the adjacent to one of my armies that I already play. I do not like them. I just don't. I don't find the aesthetic of them very cool. Their lore is okay. I like sort of the fact that they are sort of the callers, if you will, of the Tyranids invasion, kind of trying to convince some of mankind that what's actually coming is salvation through the cleansing of the hive mind and all that jazz. I think that aspect of it is cool. I just don't think they have the look that I would really like, honestly. And I like the idea of them being more like scavengers. I like the idea if maybe they could almost like tech into some of the other factions kind of stuff, especially like Imperial Guard. I think there's a lot of room for them to be able to basically just say, okay, take Imperial Guard tank, and now we have it in Genestealer Cults. And it's like you can kind of mess it up, make it look more refurbished, if you will, in that sort of aesthetic of the Genestealer Cults. Make it look a little bit more utilitarian. Have it be a little bit more, obviously they usually have this like mining trope. Give them more stuff that would make sense in the 41st millennium of being miners. Let it be, give them the termite drills from 30k. Give them, these tunneling things that are able to pop up around the board and give them more movement options, more unique options for things that they can do. But then also I think having that flexibility of maybe being able to pick other Imperium or human-based vehicles and that sort of deal to include in your army. I think that would be kind of interesting because their whole thing is at the flip of the hat, when the hive mind comes in, they get connected to the network, they turn on their brothers because they actually have the Genestealer seed within them that is like going to connect them to the hive mind, and then they become basically sleeper agents. And I think that could be a cool way to kind of show that bit of lore in the model making and that sort of deal. All right, last but not least, we have the Necrons. Give me more Canoptek, and you got me a Necrons player. I love the more chittering, the like less human look of the Canoptek stuff, the Wraiths, some of the Scarabs, even to some extent like the Scorpex and the Destroyers are okay. But yeah, I would like to see some of the aesthetic kind of push in that direction. I'm not the biggest fan of the like Terminator style warriors, but you have to play warriors with Necrons. So it's kind of like I would like to see maybe something aesthetically different, maybe some kind of Canoptek, more battle line kind of thing to replace warriors that would still give you this sort of impending doom that the warriors do. I think that would be a very cool way to basically have them be a thing that I would play. But honestly, a lot of their models are really cool. I think it's a super easy paint scheme, and there's definitely ways that you could have it really spice it up and have it be a lot of fun to play and enjoy. I've played a few Necron players and played quite a few games against Necrons, and the power fantasy of them being sort of this slow creeping dread with insane firepower is really cool. The kind of lore idea of them being like waking up from their eternal sleep gives way for some really interesting aesthetic choices with the army. You know, you can have the overgrown Necrons, which has been done before, the more rusted Necrons, which isn't really lore accurate, I don't think, but still an interesting way to paint them and kind of do it in that way. So yeah, Necrons don't really need much, honestly. Yeah, Necrons are pretty cool. All right. Well, that wraps this week's episode. Do you agree with my point of different armies? Do you agree in my opinions of the armies that I spoke about today? Do you think that Tau should lean in one way or the other? Or do you think that the direction they're going is fine, kind of being half and half, battlesuit and auxiliary? Among the other things I talked about today, definitely let me know what I got wrong about your favorite factions and why I should consider the Imperium more as a Filthy Xenos player. Thank you guys so much for your views, your likes, and your comments. It really does help me out a lot and encourage me very much. So thank you guys so much for all that you do, and thank you for your support, and I will see you all in the next one.